In July 2021, less than a year ago, Kyiv and Washington co-hosted Operation Seabreeze, a naval exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries and was directly aimed at Russia. President Zelensky, who had never shown much enthusiasm for bringing Ukraine into NATO, and who was elected in March 2019 on a platform that called for working with Russia to settle the ongoing crisis, reversed course in early 2021 and not only embraced NATO expansion, but also adopted a hardline approach toward Moscow. President Biden had long been committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO and was also super hawkish towards Russia. And you want to remember that when he was vice president in the Obama administration, President Obama assigned him, Joe Biden, with the Ukraine portfolio. So he was no stranger to this issue. Then on November 10th, 2021, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his Ukrainian counterpart signed an important document. It's called the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership.
When the wall came down in 1989 and the Soviet Union fell apart, NATO had a problem. There was no enemy left, and everyone expected NATO to wind up. The world was hoping for a period of peace and disarmament. But the Western countries didn't want to say goodbye to the military project, so they changed the NATO narrative.
I'm pleased to announce that my colleagues and I have begun a major transformation.
NATO rewrote its own mission statement, from being an alliance for mutual defense to one with the freedom to intervene in other parts of the world. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO military interventions have taken place in Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, and Libya.
Spring 1999, NATO bombs Serbia. A year later, at the request of United Nations, NATO confirms that its ammunition contained radioactive depleted uranium. A report published by the UN shows that more than a third of the people tested from this area have experienced changes in their blood cells and their DNA containing chromosomes. Serbia says the only thing that could be done at this stage is mass screening for cancer, but there are no funds for it.
By NATO estimates, more than 8,400 kilograms of depleted uranium have been fired in Yugoslavia so far. And Red Cross personnel don't know what to tell the people who rely on them.
There you can see there's a tank on the left, probably blown up during the fighting. But we don't know by what kind of weapon it was destroyed. In which case, it's certainly better to keep away from the grass here, because the uranium shells that they used can emit a certain amount of radiation. That's why we keep the windows closed too, because it's better to avoid breathing the air and dust, as it may also be radioactive.
Since NATO appears to be using depleted uranium munitions in Serbia, are there any plans, once the war is over, to have any kind of cleanup, given the reputation which these munitions have got in Iraq?
Okay, thanks for that.
Well, let me say first that yes, we have not used depleted uranium in the last few weeks.
That when we watch the mainstream media, certainly in England and I'm sure in the United States, you get this sort of vague notion that NATO is some sort of united colours of Benetton, save the world, children's charity almost. NATO's war in Afghanistan produced 5.3 million refugees. That was a quarter of the Afghan population. It left 72% of the Afghan population in poverty.
Now, what I find remarkable is that how on earth all these NATO troops couldn't stop the poppy production. And now Afghanistan provides 94% of heroin in the world. So how did that happen? Nobody knows.
Y los efectos de los recientes ataques de la OTAN sobre Libia evidencian cambios considerables. Expertos libios de la Comisión de Energía Atómica aseguran que fuerzas imperialistas hacen uso de uranio empobrecido.
NATO forces, mainly from France and Britain, began aerial bombardment on the pretext of protecting civilians. but the intervention sided with the rebels and armed them in violation of the UN Charter. With NATO's help, the opposition forces occupied the capital and later carried out the extrajudicial killing of Gaddafi. Since NATO's, quote, humanitarian intervention and the murder of Gaddafi, the country's territory has become a battleground between feuding warlords and Islamic fundamentalist groups, including the Islamic State. Libya no longer has a functioning government.
Im Gegenzug zur deutschen Einheit verspricht der Westen, die NATO nicht weiter nach Osten vorrücken zu lassen. In Washington macht der damalige Außenminister weitreichende Zusagen.
Baker addressed this question directly with Gorbachev in February '90, but assuming there is no expansion of NATO jurisdiction to the east, not 1 inch, wouldn't it be better to have a united Germany anchored in NATO?
But Mikhail Gorbachev has called NATO expansion not just a mistake, but, quote, a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made to us in 1990. Is Gorbachev a propagandist too?
This is a myth spread by Russia.
Gorbachev's answer was, of course, any expansion of NATO to the east would be unacceptable. But the other points you make are very important, and I'm going to take them seriously.
They were promised that NATO, or for that sake, the EU, wouldn't enlarge eastwards. That was never promised, and recently...
Mikhail Gorbachev, I called this a big mistake from the very beginning. It was definitely a violation of the spirit of the statements and assurances made to us in 1990. Is he lying?
The disastrous war in Afghanistan has devastated the country. Libya remains embroiled in a 10-year civil war.
He bought this with understanding no expansion to the east. We'll let Germany stay in. Essentially, when Baker made the statement, he also had in mind that even the territory of the German Democratic Republic would not be in NATO.
We broke our word, and when both Putin and Medvedev say publicly to Madeleine Albright and others, we, Russia, feel deceived and betrayed, that's what they're talking about.
U.S. President George W. Bush's plans for NATO expansion were blocked at the Bucharest summit on Thursday, after it became clear that NATO member states would not agree to fast-tracking Georgia and Ukraine into the alliance. France and Germany were concerned about provoking Moscow, which has warned of a new East-West crisis if NATO takes in the two republics.
For the autograph hunters, Russia's retiring president was the man of the hour. At the NATO summit, results made him the man of the week. And as other leaders departed, he grabbed attention on the final day. President Bush had demanded the former Soviet republics of Ukraine and Georgia be set immediately on the NATO route with membership action programs. In Bucharest, mindful of Mr. Putin's furious objections, leading European members of NATO got that plan scrapped. When Mr. Putin joined in the talks Friday, he continued his opposition to what he calls NATO expansionism, and to the US missile defense program with planned installations in Poland and the Czech Republic.
The appearance of a powerful military bloc along our borders would be taken in Russia as a direct threat to the security of my country.
Both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy were opposed to moving forward on NATO membership for Ukraine because they feared it would infuriate Russia. The Bush administration, which was pushing this policy decision for NATO, however, cared little about Moscow's brightest of red lines and pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public pronouncement that said unequivocally that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Unsurprisingly, the American-led effort to integrate Georgia into NATO resulted in a war between Georgia and Russia in August 2008, just 4 months after the Bucharest summit. Nevertheless, in the wake of that war, the United States and its allies continued moving forward.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has approved an updated military doctrine. It names NATO's military buildup near Russia's border as its main military threat. The doctrine says the deployment of foreign military forces on the territory of Russia's neighbors could be used for political and military pressure.
The point is that the United States is prepared to create a cordon sanitaire around Russia. Russia knows it. Russia believes that the United States intends to break the Russian Federation. I think that, as Peter Lorre put it, we don't want to kill you, we just want to hurt you a little bit. Either way, we are back in the old game.
Next, leaders from NATO countries met in Poland today to finalize plans to beef up the military alliance. For the first time since the Cold War, multinational troops will continuously rotate through 4 countries in Eastern Europe.
For U.S. troops who've been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is more firepower than they've ever had. U.S. soldiers are teaching Poles military hardware starting in childhood.
Princess. That's where the trust starts. From that youngest generation, building trust, they understand that America is aligned with Poland.
There you go. Good job.
Part of the Polish exercise is visiting small towns like Suwałki. Soldiers and fathers encourage kids to become comfortable with guns.
The so-called military basis policy that was established, if I'm not mistaken, in 1949 here in Norway, and it clearly stated that there should be no foreign military bases on Norwegian soil. Now, this is being hollowed out or practically just scrapped right now by the Norwegian government. This has happened without any democratic debate. It has happened without a democratic process. And basically, it's been negotiated behind closed doors between probably U.S. official or NATO officials and Norwegian officials. Practically the whole of Norway's territory is being used to close in on Russia. And many Norwegians wondered if this increased U.S. militarization actually increases our security levels, or if it provokes Russia in such a way that it increases the risk that the big great power rivalry between Russia and the U.S. is being taken unnecessarily into Norwegian soil.
The idea that Ukraine might join a Western military alliance would be quite unacceptable to any Russian leader. This goes back to 1990s. This is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to.
Worldwide military expenditure has risen to almost 2,000 billion US dollars. 2020 saw a global increase of 3%, but it's NATO that's driving the new arms race. Military investment is rising fastest in the NATO countries. Military budgets in the US and Europe are rising twice as fast as in the other continents. Behind the scenes, a powerful arms industry is making sure they are well served.
Our military-industrial complex has very, very deep roots in Congress. Military industries are in almost every congressional district. And quite frankly, when we expanded NATO, some of the most effective lobbyists were our military industrial companies like Lockheed and others, who wanted to sell the arms to the countries in Eastern Europe. But you don't need supersonic aircraft and flotillas of aircraft carriers to deal with terrorism. But you need a big enemy, a big country. It's Russia, China.
We spoke about the Swedish government's initiative to send pamphlets to all 4.8 million households warning of a potential war. and of course the kind of new Cold War that has emerged between NATO countries and Russia.
But the Swedish population has been, and it's hard to say that, but they've been victims of a process of scaremongering. There's absolutely no doubt about that. There's been, for a period, you would see almost daily front pages with the supposed war threats from Russia, threatening news from Russia every single day on television, on major news outlets, and with very little backing, very little evidence that this threat actually existed or that there was any basis for those scary headlines and front pages. Finland has also granted increased access to NATO, to its territory. As of Denmark has for a long time been more of a so-called Atlanticist country in the Scandinavian context. Some might remember that the former Secretary General of NATO was a Danish, an ex-Prime Minister, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, from Denmark, who was, by the way, it seems he was rewarded for his support for the Iraq War, because after that he became the Secretary General. And there was a similar move when the Norwegian ex-Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg became Secretary General of NATO. He still is. This happened some years after Stoltenberg played a very important role in making Norway, to have Norway join the military campaign against the illegal regime change war against Libya, and convincing even the Swedes to join that.
To the Russian illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea. You've called it a violation of the UN Charter. Some people might say that people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, given you supported the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq back in 2003. How does that work?
Yeah, now you're speaking to me personally, because NATO wasn't. NATO was not involved.
To clarify, you in your role as Prime Minister of Denmark, threw your weight behind the illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. You didn't seem to worry about the UN Charter then?
No, because it was not illegal.
Atomic weapons are back with a vengeance. NATO 2030, NATO's new report, puts it very clearly. NATO continues to play a crucial role in maintaining both conventional and nuclear deterrence.
Both conventional and nuclear firepower capability.
Nuclear weapons have been a crucial pillar of NATO's collective defense from the outset. And those who thought that the Cold War was a thing of the past are also wrong. The report clearly states, today, NATO faces two systemic rivals, Russia and China.
The accompanying expansion of neoliberalism is also a process. I'd like to start not in Kiev, but in Warsaw. Among the conditions of NATO membership was the sell-off of the very basis of Polish economic sovereignty. Mm-hmm. Now we turn to Ukraine. What has been happening since 2014? There's proposals on the table now from the RAND Corporation, one of the brains of US militarism, for the sell-off of several thousand state-owned corporations.
How, or can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border, while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida.
How would NATO react if Russia welcomed a pro-Russian regime change in, let's say, Mexico, Canada, and established its military facilities there?
We stick to the principle that each and every nation has the right to decide itself whether it will join an alliance or not. And that goes for Georgia, that goes for Ukraine, and it's not for Russia to decide.
So what would be the reaction in the US Senate if Mexico was to station some Russian bases and Russian troops?
I don't know, but I think.
What do you think would be the reaction? Do you think it would be okay? Do you think it would be a calm, moderate reaction from Senator John McCain and others?
Actually, I can't answer that question.
You know and I know that the United States would never tolerate, in its backyard, what it refers to Latin America as, Russian presence.
I think right now we are speaking pure theory.
As in the past, these rallies are designed to whip up hate of what Castro calls Yankee imperialistic warmongers. To suggest Russian technicians ripped through heavy jungle growth to carve out airstrips for high-performance MiG-21 jets, a plane easily capable of strikes far into the United States.
Many of your critics would say there's a curious paradox here, that NATO, in a sense, now exists to manage the risks created by its own existence. Some would say that, for example, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that played a role in making Russia feel encircled, alienated, isolated, and prompted Russia to respond aggressively.
On December 17th, 2021, the Russians reached the boiling point, and Moscow sent separate letters to NATO and to Biden. Many of you, I'm sure, remember when the Russians sent those letters to Biden and to NATO, demanding a written guarantee that, number one, Ukraine would not join NATO, no offensive weapons would be stationed near Russia's borders, and three, NATO troops and equipment moved into Eastern Europe since 1997 would be moved back to Western Europe.
Now, they agreed, of course, to the incorporation of the Baltic states into NATO. They didn't like it, but they acquiesced. I don't think they saw Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania in any respect as threats to Russia. They expected that these small countries would be appropriately cautious in their dealings with Russia, as Finland had been for decades. They agreed also to the Minsk Accords, which kept the Donbass and Luhansk regions as part of Ukraine, with a measure of autonomy. The main issue was, in fact, Ukraine's alignment with NATO, or its incorporation into an American sphere of influence in Europe called NATO. The Russians were not proposing to embrace Ukraine as part of their sphere of influence. They were precisely asking for its neutralization. And the fact that this was rejected was the product of a combination of triumphalism, knee-jerk Russophobia, and a desire to put Russia down.
Putin made numerous public statements during this period that left no doubt that he viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Speaking to the Defense Ministry Board on December 21st, 2021, he stated, this is quoting Putin, "What they are doing or trying or planning to do in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometers away from our national border. It's on the doorstep of our house. They must understand that we simply have nowhere further to retreat to." 2 months later, at a press conference on February 22nd, 2022, this is 2 days before they invade, Putin said, quote, "The United States and its allies," he said, quote, "continue to pump the current Kiev authorities full of modern types of weapons," end of quote. He went on to say that if this was not stopped, Moscow, quote, "would be left with an anti-Russia armed to the teeth." This is totally unacceptable.
Back in December 2021, if we remember, Russia provided draft proposals of security guarantees to the U.S. and to NATO that were meant to serve as the basis of dialogue and negotiation. They were summarily rejected.
Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to NATO, to Washington, the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on January 14th, 2022, when he said, "The key to everything," I'm quoting Lavrov now, "the key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward." Nevertheless, the efforts of Lavrov and Putin to get the United States and its allies to abandon their efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border failed completely. Secretary of State Tony Blinken responded to Russia's mid-December demands by simply saying, quote, "There is no change, there will be no change." Putin then launched an invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO.
Our actions over the past week have sharpened the choice facing Russia now.